In the 1950s, as the country awoke from depression and war, it became a very different place. The population and the economy were booming. The interest in building tall resumed. Businesses needed inexpensive office buildings, and they needed them quickly. The empty State Building was no longer empty. But skyscrapers cloaked in heavy stone wall panels like the Empire State Building cost too much to build. So architects abandoned stone for light, thin sheets of glass and metal, which made buildings faster to assemble and much more affordable.
We were at a time when, yes, the world was changing. It was the post-war period. There was a certain amount of desire for a new form of expression. But in truth, glass boxes became really common because they were cheap. They could be replicated very cheaply and easily.
This sleek new look was called the International style. For better or for worse, modern glass boxes sprang up all over the world.
People have always had very mixed feelings about skyscrapers. I think they became more negative as glass boxes became more and more common everywhere. The key thing about architecture in a city is that the buildings work together. Yet, modern buildings don't do that very well. Even the best of them want to be a thing unto themselves.
Appearance was not the only problem. These buildings held a surprise for engineers. Stripped of heavy materials like stone wall panels, glass boxes are very light. And the lighter and taller a building, the more it can sway in the wind. If a building sways too much, people inside will actually become seasick. To build tall glass skyscrapers, engineers needed a new way to stiffen their frames without adding too much expensive steel. One solution was to move most of the structure of columns and beams from the inside of the building to the perimeter. That way, the skyscraper acts like a hollow, rigid tube, making it just as strong and stiff as a traditional frame, but with much less steel. The World Trade Center was built this way, allowing it to seize the title of world's tallest from the Empire State Building. But the record books had to be rewritten again, about a year later, when Chicago stole the title from New York with the colossal 110-story Sears Tower. The tube frame took the art of building tall to new heights. Yet engineers wanted to find a way to build lighter skyscrapers using even less steel. At New York's Citicorp Center, that quest brought them face to face with disaster. When it was finished, the Citicorp building was the 7th tallest skyscraper in the world. And with its glass and aluminum skin, it was also one of the lightest. Now, light buildings use less material, so they cost less, which is why builders love them. But remember, light buildings also sway a lot more in the wind than their heavier cousins do. So structural engineer Bill LeMessurier had to come up with some way of keeping the inhabitants of Citicorp from getting seasick 60 floors up. His solution was to put a mechanical device called a tuned mass damper up near the very top of the building. Perched on the 63rd floor of Citicorp Center, above all the offices, the tuned mass damper is a 400-ton block of concrete, so large it had to be poured in place before the building was finished.
When the sensors detect motion of the building way below the level of human perception, but at a level high enough to realize that it's not just a truck going by in the street, but the wind is building up, then the pumps come on, cause this thing to be lifted and go into action.
Tied to the building by giant springs and shock absorbers, the concrete block begins to slide from side to side on a cushion of oil. When the building sways one way, the block follows. As the building begins to sway in the other direction, the massive block damps or reduces the motion. Within about a minute, the movement of the building drops to an acceptable level. The tuned mass damper makes this super-light skyscraper feel as stable as one stiffened with much more steel. The Citicorp building was the first skyscraper designed to use a tuned mass damper. Now they're in buildings all over the world. If the damper and Citicorp's striking shape had been the only features to distinguish the building, the engineers would have been very happy. But unfortunately, there were other problems left to solve. Those problems resulted from another of Citicorp's idiosyncrasies. The skyscraper was built 9 stories in the air on 4 tall columns to make room for a church under one corner. But just after Citicorp Center was completed, Lemessurier received an innocent phone call about the design that turned out to be a matter of life and death.
I got a telephone call from a student who was assigned to write a paper on this building by his professor. The professor had said there was something funny about this building because the columns were not in the corners like they ought to be.
Lemessurier explained to the student that he had placed the columns between the corners for good reason. In the early 1970s, when Citicorp was still on the drawing board, St. Peter's, an old church in disrepair, occupied one corner of the potential building site. Citicorp struck a deal with the church to demolish St. Peter's and rebuild a modern church in exchange for the right to build its skyscraper in the air just above it. Lemessurier had to place the skyscraper's heavy support columns on the center of each side so St. Peter's could fit under one corner. What made this possible, he explained to the student, was the building's extraordinary frame, a series of diagonal steel beams arranged like giant V's, channel gravity and wind loads from the corners of the building to its 4 center columns.
And that was the end of the conversation with the student.
But that student's phone call got Lemessurier thinking. A few weeks earlier, he had learned that there had been a change in the way the building was constructed. Hundreds of joints in the V-braces that were to be welded were instead bolted together to save money. It was standard practice according to the building code, but out of curiosity, Lemessurier analyzed how the substitution of bolts for welds changed the strength of the V-braces.
I pursued this, and I went to New York, and we pulled out from our own records the detailed numbers on all these joints, and found out some very awesome and frightening facts.
To his surprise, Lemessurier discovered that strong winds from a diagonal direction could sever the bolts in the V-braces and rip the joints apart.
I came to the conclusion that a storm which had a probability of occurring every 16 years, or once in 16 years, would cause the building to fail, break, and collapse. If I do nothing, this thing has a high probability of falling down in my lifetime. This is an intolerable situation. I can't live with that.
Lemessurier devised a plan to reinforce the hundreds of bolted joints by welding large steel plates over them. But so many repairs would take time, and time was something he did not have. It was July, and hurricane season was just around the corner. Every available welder from as far away as Louisiana was rushed to the building to begin repairs. While they worked under the cover of darkness to avoid panic, the Red Cross and city officials held secret meetings to prepare for the worst.
The scenario was very clear that a sustained wind of over 70 miles an hour could tip this building right over. There are tens of thousands of people right here in this neighborhood. We could be talking thousands of casualties here.
The building is 900 feet tall. So if it breaks off somewhere a couple of 100 feet above the ground and falls north, it will lie on the top of other buildings all the way to Bloomingdale's.
The possible impact zone extended about 6 blocks around the Citicorp building, an area that holds several 100,000 people. Trying to evacuate them on a moment's notice might have been futile.
There isn't a lot of reality to think you can evacuate Midtown Manhattan. You have to play a scenario as to what time of day, what day of the week. 5 o'clock rush hour, not very real to think that you can evacuate Midtown Manhattan.
The welding took several weeks, and the job stretched into early September, just as Hurricane Ella was blowing north. If the winds were right, she would hit New York City within days.
We had 3 different weather services constantly reporting every 3 hours on what the weather in the North Atlantic was.
With no way to complete the repairs in time, no one could be sure how the building would survive a hurricane's violent punch. But just when everything seemed its darkest, fate intervened, and Ella veered out to sea. New York had dodged what could have been a horrific catastrophe. The repairs were finished, and the Citicorp crisis went unnoticed for almost 20